architectural photography. I've got notes all over the place here, so I may make a mistake here, but hopefully not. Obviously, so photography of the man-made environment, the built environments, everything that's sort of that we live in and we work in and so on. So that's architectural photography, and it covers sort of a variety of areas, which I'm going to just briefly run through. Obviously, it starts at one extreme of actual entire urban skylines. So in this instance, at Shanghai at sunrise, it may not be particularly beautiful, the Shanghai skyline, but it's certainly very interesting, and in silhouette it really creates quite an interesting outline, a solid block of buildings which create quite a nice outline against the sky. So urban skylines really are sort of the one extreme end of architectural photography. More often, of course, it's about single buildings or parts of single buildings, and that's where we're looking at sort of photography of the design and the structure of the buildings, and so their usefulness and what the architect was trying to say, and whether the beauty or otherwise of a particular building. In this particular instance, I think it's rather an attractive building. As you see, it's a restaurant. It's a restaurant actually in the Philippines on a beach resort, taken at dusk. Dusk shots are often really nice for architectural photography, particularly for modern buildings with large windows and so on, because you can have semi-darkness outside and then the beautiful lights, artificial lights from inside the building shining out, and that can be really quite effective. And then moving on from there, not just entire buildings, but also just details, just little snippets of individual buildings, which with modern architecture is generally just about the interplay of light, shape, form, and to some extent, well, quite often, I suppose, color actually. So just curves and diagonals and triangles and so on. With historic buildings, it's more often about the embellishments, but also sometimes about about curves and about diagonals and triangles and so on, and the interplay of light. In this instance, on a detail of a Chinese building, traditional Chinese building in Shanghai, it's a bit of all of those, but both about curves and triangles and diagonals, but also a bit about the embellishment of the building as well. So details, pictures not just of whole buildings, but close details of the structure, often things that have been put in there by the architects as a sort of some kind of feature, which hopefully as an architectural photography you might be able to spot and pull out and really show off to the world. And then at the sort of other end of architectural photography from entire urban skylines, there's the interiors. A lot of people think of interiors photography as being rather separate from architectural work, but it is really rather integral to it. They two go hand in hand, really. Expression both of the outside of the building and then of the inside too. And so that's quite an important part of the architectural work, is shooting indoors. This one, what I've shown you so far, is quite an international collection of pictures. This one, however, is on Dartmoor in Devon, so much closer to home, much closer to my home anyway. And so that's sort of general breadth of the subject matter that you might cover with architectural photography, all the way from its whole skylines, urban skylines, through to details of interiors of the buildings, whether that be a restaurant or a home or a public space or whatever. Anyway, so we'll come to the techniques of photographing architecture. Now, there's always tell people when we're doing an architectural course that there's basically two styles of shooting, you might say. There's the technically correct, and then there's the creative. And this particular shot is neither of those, and I'll come on to in a moment to describing what technically correct and what creative actually mean. And I say this one is neither. It shows what I'm showing you here really is what you so often see with architectural photography, or pictures of buildings. I say that's not architectural photography, but pictures of buildings, particularly when we're dealing with tall buildings. And what we have here is really, the building is so tall, the buildings, I should say, are so tall that you, in order to be able to get them all in the frame, you've had to tilt the camera back. And then what the result of that is that then you get all your verticals are no longer parallel as they should be, but they're now converging, and the building is leaning, or buildings in this case are leaning backwards, and it just doesn't look right. It looks a bit weird. However, however that may be, we're all so used to seeing pictures where this is happening that we kind of almost just accept it as a normal part of photography, that this is what comes out when you photograph buildings, particularly tall buildings. But actually, when it comes to sort of top quality, serious architectural photography, it's kind of not really very acceptable. It doesn't sit into either the technically correct style of photography nor the creative style of photography. It's just something that didn't really quite work. And you know, I pressed the shutter button here anyway, just in order to have a picture, just as the record as much as anything. But I knew it wouldn't really do my work any justice, and probably wouldn't do anybody that might want to use the picture any justice either. So what we need to do is either be highly creative or be technically correct. And this is what I mean by technically correct. Actually shooting in such a way that your verticals really are vertical and absolutely parallel to each other, so that you then get a picture where everything is in what you might call correct perspective. The trouble is, we're so unused to seeing photographs of buildings in this way that actually it looks a little bit weird. It looks quite austere and quite stark and just not quite right. But this is the way one needs to shoot for technically correct architectural photography. The funny thing is, well, the way to do this actually, first of all, is, well, there are two basic ways of doing it. Firstly, there is the use of what's called a shift lens, which that's a lens that enables the camera to look upwards while nevertheless still keeping the camera sensor, the back of the camera, vertical and therefore parallel to the walls of the building. So you don't get that tipping back effect of the building sort of tipping backwards, and the parallel verticals no longer parallel but actually converging. So the lens actually looks upwards while keeping the camera in the vertical position, the camera back in the vertical position parallel to the building's walls. The second way of doing it is to just shoot in the usual sort of way, just use a wide angle lens, tilt the camera back, and then correct it all in Photoshop afterwards. And that works quite well up to a point. It's when you get to be doing it fairly extreme level, then it starts to break down, because you, as you're trying to straighten those converging parallels into truly vertical lines, you're actually interpolating the pixels. The pixels are guessing what should be there, and the more you do it, the more extreme you do it, then the more you're in danger of having the image quality deteriorate. So you're best off, if you're doing it in camera, if you possibly can, with a shift lens or with a wide angle lens taken with the back of the camera still parallel to the building, and I'll show you possible ways of doing that in a moment, or a combination of the shift lens and Photoshop, just sort of doing the final touch up in Photoshop if necessary. Now, as I said just now, this whole thing of having all these verticals actually parallel and vertical does look a little stark and a little strange to the eye that's used to pictures of buildings leaning backwards. And in fact, if you have everything in the picture, all the buildings really genuinely vertical and with parallel vertical lines, it actually looks very weird, because the buildings in the middle, the main buildings, start to look like they're bulging outwards towards the top, even though actually when you analyze the picture they're not. But it's a kind of a trick of an optical illusion that makes it look like the top of the building is bulging outwards, which is very strange. And so very often what architectural photographers do is they actually leave in a little bit of the converging parallel vertical. So if you look at the buildings on the edge of the picture here, they're still leaning over slightly, they're still converging slightly, and I've done that deliberately in order to ensure that the buildings in the middle do nevertheless still look vaguely real, that they are actually still quite parallel and quite completely vertical, not bulging outwards at the top. I hope that makes sense. It's slightly difficult to describe, but hopefully you can understand what I'm saying there. Anyway, if we move on and then we come to creative photography, this is what I mean by creative photography. Back to the sort of original picture we had at the very beginning. Really, in this instance, really quite abstract. It doesn't have to be abstract, but in this instance, it really is just bare walls. So we're looking at sort of strong diagonals, triangles, angles, all sorts of weird angles. The camera's tilted. The camera's tilted at several angles, actually, tilted backwards and tilted to the side. We're just trying to create something that was really artistically effective, very graphic, very dynamic. Because after all, we're shooting something which is naturally very static, and which in the case of some buildings can actually, the buildings themselves can actually be frankly a little bit boring. And so in a photograph you want to try and liven it up a bit with by putting in some dynamism, a sense of movement and energy. And that's what you do with the diagonals. Anybody who's ever been on a landscape photography course with me will be thoroughly familiar with me banging on about this, with the use of diagonals and triangles and trying to put energy and dynamism into a picture. Well, this is the same sort of thing applied to the creative style of architectural photography. And with the two techniques of technically correct and creative photography, they're not mutually exclusive in architectural photography. They can overlap, and you can use the two techniques in the same project, just mix and match. And from the point of view of professional photographer, very often just shooting in the predominance of one style or the other, perhaps depending on who your customer is. Well, obviously, if you're shooting for yourself, then you're going to shoot in whichever style you really want to. Anyway, first of all, I'm going to concentrate on technically correct architectural photography. So we look at these two images taken in Shanghai again of this collection of office towers, not particularly interesting architecturally, but nevertheless they say something about the incredible dynamism and building work of Shanghai. Now on the left we have a picture where, rather similar to the one I showed you just now, the towers in Shanghai, not quite managed to get there really. The buildings are leaning still. Both pictures were actually taken with a shift lens, but the one on the left I was much closer to the buildings and couldn't really get the angle right in order to have the buildings perfectly vertical. And so I've got them sort of converging slightly, and just it's neither creative nor is it technically correct, and so it's just not very satisfactory. I could have tried to correct that leaning in Photoshop, but then I would have, what would have happened there, if you look at the right-hand side of the picture here, I would have lost the right-hand edge of this golden building, and that would not have worked at all well, so it didn't bother trying to do that. Instead, what I did was I actually backed off 40 or 50 yards away from the buildings, and then I was far enough away for the shift mechanism on the lens to actually work. So I then had these buildings perfectly vertical. All their vertical lines are actually vertical and parallel, and so they've got the correct perspective on the building. So this is a good example of sort of technically correct architectural photography. It's a shame that the buildings aren't particularly interesting in terms of architecture, but that's the way things go. But we'll move on and look at something which is architecturally a lot more interesting. It's a modern rendition of traditional kind of style of building, probably a little bit Caribbean actually, but it nevertheless is a hotel in the Philippines. So it's clearly stolen style from elsewhere. Now this is taken, as you can see, it's taken at dusk, and it's taken with a standard lens, not a shift lens, but I've managed to keep the verticals vertical and parallel, and I've done that by keeping the camera level, keeping the back of the camera vertical and parallel to the building. And the result is that the building is up in the top half of the picture, and we've got a lot of foreground in the picture. So if you're going to, this is one way of shooting architectural pictures without use of a shift lens. You use a lens that will can contain the whole building. Obviously, with just a two-story building, that's not too difficult. And you then angle it in such a way that you can keep everything parallel and vertical, but you do end up with a lot of foreground. And so in that instance, you've got to make darn sure that your foreground is really very, very interesting. In this case, we've got some nice water creating a lovely reflection of the building and of the lights in the evening. So that works really quite nicely. That's a way of getting a nice technically correct picture without the use of a shift lens, and keep having quite a very nice, interesting, moody and atmospheric composition as well. We move on to something kind of similar with historic architecture. We can do the same thing with historic buildings. This is a shot in Bath of Pulteney Bridge, an very famous 18th century bridge, and using just an ordinary wide-angle lens, no shift lens involved here. Again, keeping the back of the camera vertical and parallel to the building, we ended up with the bridge itself in the top half of the picture, and then leaving a huge amount of foreground in between me and the bridge, which, if it were just grass or gravel or concrete or something, would be very unpleasant and very distracting, not very great. But because we've got this beautiful expanse of very calm water, we've got this fabulous reflection, which is just completely, reflecting our main building, and then so doubling the size of the subject and bringing it down into the bottom half of the frame as well. I should also add that those of you who know about neutral density graduated filters for landscape photography, it's also been used here, so you can use it for some forms of architectural photography. Top half of the filter is darker, the bottom half of the filter is clear, and the line that separates the clear and dark parts of the filter I've lined up with the water surface, so going across the middle of the picture. So that I've darkened the bridge itself and the building on the left, and I've lightened the water, and we've ended up balancing the picture almost perfectly, so that the reflection has almost exactly the same exposure as the bridge. So we've got this perfect reflection. We often forget that the light coming off water is much darker than the light that's coming off our subject up in the air, the building itself. Because the reason we forget that is because our eyes can accommodate both very easily, and they look pretty similar to our eyes and our brain. But to the camera sees only exactly what's actually there, and in fact, there's a lot less light reflecting off the water than is reflecting off the building. And so, to take a photograph without an ND grad filter, the reflection in the water is much darker than the building itself. So it doesn't come out balanced. And it doesn't look quite right. Use an ND grad filter, neutral density graduated filter, and you darken the top half of the picture and lighten what's coming up off the water, and you have this wonderfully balanced picture with the reflection and the building itself exposed with having the same exposure. All right, so move on. More pictures of Bath. No prizes for guessing this. It's the Roman baths with Bath Abbey behind, and another example of how to use a really wide-angle lens to capture architectural photography in a technically correct sort of way. All my verticals are parallel and actually vertical. Basically, raise myself halfway up, a little bit higher up, and my foreground is then actually something which is down below me. Again, if it was just gravel or grass, it really wouldn't be very interesting. But in this instance, it's the very famous Roman baths. It's absolutely extremely interesting as a critical component, integral to the picture that we've got here. So a raised position, also shooting sort of diagonally across the whole scene, so that you get more of it in. If I was sort of further forward past this statue and trying to photograph straight onto this building, everything would be much too big and I wouldn't get it all in. But by going into the corner and shooting diagonally across the scene, I'm getting a lot more of the scene in and really getting everything that's important in fact. So it's really capturing the whole scene. Would like to see a little bit more of the bath perhaps, and indeed if I was to hold the camera vertically and get a portrait shot, then of course I can get more of the bath and still get the whole of the abbey in, but then I lose part of this building here. Like the left-hand side of the building gets chopped off a little bit, which not quite so appealing. So it's obviously sometimes it's a little bit of a compromise of what you try to get, but in this instance, this kind of thing works really quite well. So anyway, that's kind of the technically correct outdoor architectural photography. We'll come on a little bit more technically correct stuff for the interiors in a minute, but for the external architecture, that's it for technically correct photography. Then we come to the artistic stuff, or the creative stuff, perhaps I should say. And then, as I say, just about anything goes. All sorts of weird and wonderful angles. In fact, sometimes the weirder and more wonderful, the better, because you really want to try to accentuate some of the lines on the buildings. You want to liven things up. You want to make it much more dynamic and full of sense of energy. And so you get this kind of shot. As you can see, this is taken at outside the entrance to the Haynes Motor Museum in Somerset. And so that you obviously can guess then what that red, white, and blue picture earlier was. It's the same view, well, further along the same wall, showing the outside wall of this museum. Makes a fantastically graphic shot. The architecture itself is not particularly exciting, but when you take that kind of creative shot and just tilt the camera and have combine those colors into something diagonal and triangular, it becomes really quite an effective picture. This also actually reminds me to tell you as well that all the usual rules about photography that I've hopefully mentioned before really apply in architectural photography as well, which is keep it simple, keep your compositions as simple as you possibly can, because those are the most effective. Your single strong subject has the impact on the viewer. Less is more, so don't try and jam too much into the picture. Just really keep it simple to your main subject and the simple negative space around it. And the reason for that is because clutter, and well, the more stuff you try to put into the frame, the more there is the risk of clutter and competing elements competing for your attention, not just the main subject. And clutter is really your main enemy in all forms of photography, including architectural photography. And in architectural photography, your main clutter enemies really are things like double yellow lines, parked cars, overhead wires, TV aerials and satellite dishes, and so on and so forth. So all the usual, wheelie bins. Yes, that's another really favorite of mine, wheelie bins. They can do all sorts of damage to what would otherwise be a great architectural photograph. So in many ways, the creative side of architectural photography aims to cut past as much of that as possible and exclude it. In some of the technically correct photography, you may end up including some of the things, especially if you include the base of the building, which you may do if you're shooting really for an architectural client or the owner of the building perhaps, or for an architectural magazine. But even then you want to try and minimize all that junk if you possibly can. But in terms of creative photography, you really want to try and cut through that and keep it out of the frame absolutely as much as you possibly can. In fact, that means just don't have it in the picture, basically. Anyway, so move on, and we could have the same kind of thing with just a modern apartment building. This is taken on the harbour side in Exmouth in Devon, and attractive buildings, architecturally not particularly exciting, but though actually quite attractive in their way. And you can make it a little bit more exciting by not only having a low angle shot and angling the camera upwards, but also angling the camera sideways, tilting it quite a bit. And if you're going to do this, you really have to tilt the camera a lot. If you tilt the camera just a little bit, it looks like you just couldn't keep the camera straight, and it doesn't really look right. It's just your building's just not straight in the frame, and that's not what you want. You want to really tell people that you've got the camera tilted over and got a nice strong diagonal, and so you really have to tilt the camera quite a bit to get this really sort of slanting diagonal energetic kind of effect. And also, as you can see, very simple composition, no clutter, no competition for attention, and photographed in some nice evening sunlight as well to really bring out the orange colours of this building. Same kind of thing with historic architecture, the Royal Crescent in Bath. Coming in really close and low with a wide angle lens, the camera is tilted back. It's not tilted sideways, it's just tilted back and looking upwards. So you can see very clearly, of course, over here and here that the building really is leaning back enormously. We've got very strong diagonals, definitely not a technically correct picture, but nevertheless quite creative one, especially making use of the curve that is in this wonderful building. Anybody who's ever tried to photograph the Royal Crescent will know it is really an almost impossible building to photograph in its entirety, because if you do, you end up having to photograph it as a panoramic, because it is such a long and relatively low building, just 3 stories high really, and you'd have to get it to work, you'd have to stand back quite some way, and then you'd end up getting a lot of parked cars in the foreground right in front of the building. So it's often just better just to abandon the idea of trying to photograph the whole of the Royal Crescent, and just come in close and get something a little bit zany, a little bit creative like this. And then the same kind of thing with cathedrals. This Exeter Cathedral in Devon. Often when you're short of space, this is on the southern side of the cathedral. Anybody who knows the Exeter Cathedral will know that on the southern side is that just space is quite limited. There's a small yard there, and it's difficult to back up very far. So you're always quite close in and low below the building. So you're shooting up at quite a strong angle. So just using a wide angle lens up close to the building and tipping the camera right back and getting these really strong diagonals, just pointing up to the heavens. And lots of lines pointing that way and giving us a strong angles. Again, bathed in rather nice evening sunlight, which is giving us a really good golden colour on the stone there. Again, no clutter. It's a little bit complicated, and this is typical of historic buildings, particularly cathedrals. Of course, we've got quite a lot of embellishments on the walls and so on, which from the architectural point of view can be a little bit distracting. It's obviously not the sort of thing you're going to see on a modern building. Modern buildings are obviously much simpler, but on the historic buildings, this is the kind of thing that you have to deal with, and it's trying to keep it as effective as you possibly can with everything pointing up towards the sky in this instance. Using the same sort of technique, even a multi-story car park can end up looking pretty good, and that's what this is in the heart of Exeter, coming in really close to the wall, pointing the camera straight up at the top of the building using a very wide angle lens, and then making the most of this curve that's in the building, and really just giving us quite an atmospheric shot, very dynamic, very angular, very sense of dynamism and energy and movement. And then these lines, and I think it's a shot that really works quite well. I'm always quite happy if I do the architectural photography course in Exeter, which I do from time to time. I always bring people to this multi-story car park because it's such an unexpected thing to be able to photograph a nice picture of such a building. Very rare thing to be able to do. And then moving on to the meteorological office, also in Exeter, dusk shot. And this shows us capitalizing on an architectural feature of the building, which is at the front of the building, just above the facade. There's a very strong angular overhanging roof. It's not a right angle at all. It's quite a strong diagonal roof, a very pointed angle of the roof. So I'm not, in this instance, trying to photograph the whole building at all. I'm just pointing the camera up towards the sky and just really concentrating on this very triangular corner of the building, just to give you a really strong arrow sense of the building, and just sort of again a lot of dynamism and energy in that shot, and coupled with the rather nice dusk light, giving us a nice violet color in the sky, coupled with the artificial light coming out from the building itself. And a little bit more of more modern architecture. Got a series of 3 images now of the same building. This is the Titanic Museum in Belfast, and typically of modern buildings, and this one really takes it to the extreme, but it's very much about the interplay of light and shape and color, and in this instance really very graphic shapes in terms of triangles and parallelograms and so on, and it's really a beautiful sort of complex pattern, but one which really holds together and reflecting the evening sunlight combined with that stormy sky as well, really creates something quite strong and quite special shot in this creative way. Again, quite close in under the wall with a wide angle lens shooting upwards at the sky, and just really concentrating on those patterns in the face of the building. Something rather a little bit different of the same building, backing off a little bit using a short telephoto lens, and just really showing one corner of the top of the building. And I've tilted the camera a little bit, as you can possibly see from the right-hand side of the building here. It's angled over. I haven't actually tilted it very far, deliberately, have to say, although you might, based on what I said just now, you might say I haven't tilted it far enough, but I quite like it anyway because of the strong angles that it shows, excuse me, in the shapes, in the triangles and the parallelograms in the wall itself. And I just really love the way it reflects the light, and really that light really shows up these shapes absolutely magnificently, and set off against quite a dark sky behind it. The whole thing is just this combination of geometric shapes. And we move on to that, then we come then into close details and really just showing up again just the geometric shapes, the triangles and the parallelograms and so on, and the diagonals cutting across it all. It's quite busy, definitely quite busy, but unified in its busyness in the sense that the lines, we've got groups of lines going in certain directions. We've got main lines going bottom left to top right, or the other way, whichever we prefer, and then we've got lines here going down, not exactly parallel, but they're converging. That's probably largely because I'm tilting the camera up. So a shot taken reasonably close to the wall, but backed off a little bit with a telephoto lens, probably 200mm lens, just homing in on some of the details. Again, reflecting the evening sunlight, just so really showing up the patterns in the side of this building very, very nicely. So that sort of is the introduction really to details in our buildings, and that's what we're going to show for the next couple of minutes, is details. And again, in modern buildings, you can have all sorts of it's all about graphic shapes, geometric shapes, simplicity, and sort of, in this instance, quite almost industrial in many ways, although these are sort of the you might say the railings on a balcony of an apartment building in Exmouth in Devon, and in some ways I think these railings are meant to reflect the shapes of ribs on the inside structure of a boat's hull, and I think that's where the inspiration here is coming from. But it's a classic sort of modern architecture detail that you might try to create, again reflecting evening sunlight, so they're showing up beautifully golden. They're not actually golden in daylight, in normal daylight, I think, but they reflect the sunset light beautifully to become this beautiful golden color. And of course, shot like this, looking along the balcony, you've got this repeating pattern all the way along, part of which is sharply in focus, but going out of focus towards the back there. And it's just gives us a nice sort of detail about what these modern apartments are like, what their architecture is like. But you can still do the same kind of thing or similar kinds of things with historic buildings, although a lot of historic buildings are heavily embellished, and very often details of such buildings is about the embellishment. It can also be quite simple, quite just a small detail about general pattern and style. So that's what we have here with Pulteney Bridge in Bath. Just got a simple reflection of the 1.5 arches of the bridge, just a reflection in the water. So it's really all primarily just about this line and its curve here, and then sort of repeat of that line and its curve there. So just really showing up a nice sort of simple pattern as a detail in this bridge. Obviously not in the bridge itself, but in its reflection, and that's kind of part of the attraction as far as I'm concerned. Then often details in a building will be a window. So again, in Bath, just a grille window with also the shadow of a street light thrown in for added measure. Some people might say that street light is an added bit of clutter and a bit of confusion, but actually I think it adds just a little extra element to that picture. I think without that street light shadow, it would the picture would be a little bit empty. Excuse me, my voice is cracking up. Just going to take a drink. So this is kind of fairly typical of some of the historical or details of a historical building that you might find if you're looking around the streets of an old city. This is the kind of thing that you would keep an eye out for in trying to create a nice simple composition of a detail. And then in a similar kind of idea, window, really ultimate simplicity of a detailed shot, a villa on the island of Stromboli in the south of Italy, just blue and white sky with a blue and white building, the detail obviously just the shutters of blue shutters of a window against the white wall against a blue and white sky. Just a very, very simple little detail, which speaks volumes in many ways about the architectural style of this island. And then I've always really loved this picture. It's a very, very simple shot, but for me, it's so clean and so exactly pure is not quite the right word, but it's just such a clean shot. I really love it. There's no clutter, no competing detail. We're talking about competing detail. We look at the embellishments that you have on a lot of historical buildings, in particular churches and cathedrals. And this is the facade of Exeter Cathedral. Huge numbers of carvings and sculptures on that west face of Exeter Cathedral, as there are on many cathedrals. And this is just one of them. There are multiple ways that you can try to photograph them. Obviously, quite often they're a little bit high up on the building, and so you can't necessarily get a real face-to-face shot of such a detail, unfortunately. So, and that's the case here as well. This little carving here was some little way above my head, so that's why I'm sort of looking up at it. And but I thought I would photograph it in a slightly zany sort of way, left of field sort of way, I suppose. And so rather than stand away from the building and point the camera straight at it and have the faces with the wall behind, I thought I'd come in right in underneath it and then photograph straight up. So we got part of the wall of the cathedral there and then a good bit of sky. But the main point I wanted to sort of raise with this particular shot is just the strong sunlight. And you can see obviously the strong sunlight creates really strong colors, nice saturation, bright light on the building, but it also creates some very deep shadows and some very strong highlights, which some people would find unattractive. Some people like this kind of thing a lot, but I say some people find this kind of unattractive because the deep shadows and the bright highlights can hide some of the details that you might otherwise see in a softer light. And so very often, not always, but very often, it's better to photograph these little details in a soft light. So while the facade of the building is in the shade, as we have here, also on that west facade of Exeter Cathedral, a very different kind of sculpture, just a face taken while it's in the shade, and it's very soft lighting as a result. And really all the details are visible. Nothing is lost in deep shadow, nothing is lost in bright highlight. Overall, the whole thing is a bit sort of melancholy. It's a very thoughtful sort of face, and it's a rather sad one in the sense that half of it has been lost with the ravages of time, have taken away a good chunk of the face, and so it's sort of reflecting on the sort of ravages of time and the passage of time. But the details that are there are all visible because of the nice soft lighting that I photographed it in. And this has been used on the cover of a couple of magazines, and so it's been really quite successful in a live sort of commercial sense anyway. So from here we're going to move on and look at interiors, and this is going to be the final section of this talk, looking at interiors. And of course that's the inside of buildings varies enormously from huge public spaces that are making some kind of statements to the outside world, all the way through to the most intimate corners of your home, whether it be your bedroom or your bathroom, so tiny, very small spaces, and then back up to these enormous public spaces that are making a statement. So for those of you who don't know this view, probably most of you actually, this is inside the Harper Concert Hall in Reykjavik in Iceland. And what we have here is I'm standing on the ground floor of the hall, looking straight up at the ceiling. So this enormous triangle here is the ceiling of the building. And you can see it's quite a structure. We've got the beautiful triangle here, giving this strong diagonal pointing down towards the building, and over on the left and over on the right and at the bottom we've got two of the building's walls. The walls all glass, the ceiling reflective, a mass of hexagons, and it's really quite a statement really by the city of Reykjavik about their economy, perhaps about their city status and their sort of desire to promote culture and so on, and be a really valuable public space for the city. That's really quite for me a strong, very strong, very dynamic, creative sort of space which lends itself very much to creative architectural photography, and it's a great spot to go and photograph. I can tell you. If that's a sort of an urban statement, modern urban statement, then the next thing is very much a religious statement. Obviously, if you think about this huge nave, cathedral nave, is actually Wells Cathedral in Somerset, put up 900 years ago or so. So think about the people living at that time, living in hovels of just wood and mud and so on. And then we have this enormous structure, internal structure, that's just a huge religious statement, still pretty awe-inspiring to us today, to this very day. And in terms of photographically speaking, it's kind of a triumph of the shift lens. You see we're showing the massive amount of the ceiling, just the right amount of floor, and then all our arches, the verticals are all vertical and parallel. So it's really something that you just cannot normally get in a cathedral unless you're using a shift lens, and that's really the kind of sort of crux of trying to get this kind of technically correct type of picture of the interior of an historic building or any kind of large building, really. So if the previous picture of Harper Concert Hall was a real statement of creative architectural photography, this is very much a statement of technically correct architectural photography. This was taken handheld, by the way, because I know that using tripods in a cathedral when you haven't asked for permission can be a bit of a no-no. So this was handheld. It was photographed with the Canon EOS 5D Mark IV, which I know performs really well at high ISO. So this was shot handheld with an ISO of 1600, and the 30th of a second handheld and just f/5. So even though the f/5 means the lens aperture was quite wide open, it's still given me quite a big depth of field, and it's worked really very well. So I'm really quite happy about the result of this picture. So if you need a camera that shoots really well at high ISO, I can thoroughly recommend this particular camera. So we move on, and then to a statement about a seat of learning, and this is the library at Trinity College in Dublin. And here I just love this picture because I love a bit like Wells Cathedral, the repeating arches, both of the sort of the central aisle, central nave, maybe you could say, and also the repeating arches in the alcoves on the first floor above. And here you can see I've not made any attempt to make my converging parallels actually parallel and vertical. So this is a kind of a creative shot. And I think I like this shot. I've created, caught the atmosphere of this library quite well. You might wonder why I haven't sort of done the standard sort of shot, same sort of shot as I did with Wells Cathedral, just look down the main aisle at ground floor level. Well, actually I did, but the result is not really that exciting and not really something I wanted to show you from an architectural photography point of view, because it was so full of tourists all milling around, getting in the way of the camera. So it wasn't a great shot as far as I was concerned. This was photographed on a tripod because here I was officially I was photographing for a Swiss magazine. So I had a guide with me from the university. So use of tripod was absolutely fine. So it enabled me to just line up exactly what I want and take whatever time I needed. And then entertainment or industrial architecture. This is the Guinness Brewery in Dublin. Here now I have got my verticals parallel, and because obviously I'm shooting with a standard wide angle lens, not a shift lens, but I've got a lot of stuff below as well as above that I want to have in the shot. So I'm able to just keep the camera dead straight, dead level, and just shoot straight ahead of me and have interesting stuff at my height, above me and below me. It's created quite a nice composition. I'm using the railings here to actually lead the eye of the viewer into the middle of the frame here. That's the plan anyway. Again, I was able to use a tripod and so I could take my time and get a reasonable depth of field. And we move on to hotel photography and a lobby of a hotel that believes itself to be rather upmarket, and it's photographed in Manila, so it speaks of sort of luxury and opulence, and that's the kind of style that they're trying to put over here. And you'll see now that's definitely keeping the verticals parallel. By using a little bit of a shift lens here to actually get everything lined up correctly, to actually make sure that we're getting the correct perspective on everything. And you'll see in the remaining interior shots that we're doing this all the time now. And for professional interiors photography, where we're shooting for some kind of sort of tourism promotion client or an estate agent or an architect, then for interiors photography, this is what we're doing all the time, is keeping our verticals parallel all the time, using either a shift lens or using a wide angle lens, and then correcting in Photoshop afterwards. Of course, in this instance, when you're shooting interiors like this, you're actually tending to angle the camera downwards because you don't want to have too much ceiling in. You want to have a bit more floor to photograph the furniture and so on. So in this instance, instead of all the vertical lines leading inwards, they're leading outwards, and that looks really quite weird. But again, a lot of people are completely used to seeing that and don't hardly even notice it until you actually see a shot that has a correct perspectives. This is actually a holiday let on a farm in East Devon. And then another shot, same sort of thing, a domestic space, obviously kitchen and dining area, and same kind of idea, keeping everything, all the verticals parallel. Here we have reflective surfaces. So problem here is what you'll look out for the photographer is not to get your reflection in the shot. That's always quite a critical and problematic area to avoid. This was part of quite a big series of shoots I did for Airbnb a couple of years ago. This is a holiday let somewhere in Devon. I can't actually remember where at the moment, but that's where it was. And then finally, we come to the ultimate intimate space, the bathroom. Absolutely photographer's nightmare photographing bathrooms, partly because they're usually pretty small, and secondly because they're usually full of reflective surfaces, either mirrors or glass screens or shiny walls. And a lot of bathrooms, it's really very, very difficult not to get your reflection in. But when you do, you can end up with some wonderful pictures photographed in the ambient light. I should actually say all these interior shots are taken with just whatever ambient light was available. Don't use any artificial lighting myself. I don't put any extra lighting in at all myself anymore. In the days of film, years ago, used to do a little bit of that, but now with digital photography, don't do it at all. Rely on Photoshop to actually fill in any deep shadows or dampen down any highlights that are too strong, and just use the ambient light that's available. And so that's kind of with the architectural photography. Actually, also the other thing to point out with interior photography is making sure you've got yourself at the right height. You don't want to be too low, you don't want to be too high. Whatever the right height is, it's kind of should be the natural perspective for someone standing up, looking at it. Obviously, that to some extent depends on how tall you are. And I'm pretty tall. I'm over 6 feet tall, so my natural angle of viewing things is rather different from a lot of other people's. And I found I've had to bring my camera down to a slightly lower level to satisfy most people in terms of what they consider to be the natural viewing angle. So that you see, this viewing angle is not too high. And if we go back to the previous shot, again, it's sort of hopefully a fairly natural viewing angle for someone standing up, an adult standing up viewing the scene. So move on, and so that's kind of the final shot, and then finally just the usual thing, just final shot to show you, as usual, the books, and use the website for buying or browsing, looking at my books, and the photo galleries, and then also the photography courses and reviews. And you can watch past talks on the website as usual and sign up for future events. If you've been on the website since, or been to the talk section of the website since yesterday, you'll see that I've now actually put up a new series of talks. For the first series of talks, the last one will be next month. I now put up a new series of talks running from July through till the end of this year. You'll notice that there is no talk in August. I thought I'd give myself a month off, and but there is now a whole series of talks up there for the rest of this year. And the first few of them, you can sign up for them already. So the next talk is about people photography on the 16th of June. And the only other thing I want to tell you about is that the website I have for my publishing company, Aquaterra Publishing, is undergoing a complete revamp, and that's going to be completely relaunched pretty soon. With it's going to include a wide-ranging book and print shop selling books, not just those by me, but a whole range of travel and natural history books. Initially travel and natural history just to the UK, because it's anticipating a bit of a staycation this year. So it's going to be books by a whole range of authors, not just by me. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. So that will be up and running live, hopefully next week. So anyway, what I'll do now, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and then you can ask questions if you want to. There we go. If anybody wants to. If you want to turn your microphones on, if you want to ask questions, then obviously turn your microphone on. If you want to be visible, turn your camera on. If you want to remain invisible, then don't turn your camera on. So entirely your choices. So any questions? Anybody got any questions out there? So if I've sort of blown your minds, we'll rush through it so fast.
Nigel, it's Mark.
Hi there, Mark. Yeah.
I've not come across shift lenses before. Are they expensive pieces of glass?
Sorry to tell you, but yes, they are horribly expensive.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, you are shelling out an awful lot of money, and I don't really expect someone to do that unless they really are very serious architectural photography. So I've tried to, as much as possible. I wanted to show you some of the shots that you can get with a shift lens, but most of the time people are going to be shooting, of course, with just an ordinary lens, and in which case you're going to be using primarily the sort of creative styles of photography, but using those techniques that I showed you about making sure you've got a good foreground in front of your building if you're going to try and shoot with with your verticals parallel and vertical.
So I need to nut.
Oh, Nigel, you can always hire a lens from a lens hire company. Try it before you buy it.
That's very true. Yeah, you can hire lenses, and also Canon now lets you borrow equipment for 48 hours if you want to try it out first before you buy it. But it still doesn't make the lens any cheaper when you do actually buy it. But if you want
I don't know where he is, but there's lens in Plymouth that lend to students and that. They're very good.
Yeah, there are a couple of places around the country where you can hire lenses. So if you want to try them out, that's another good option too. Yeah. Anybody else?
It's me again. So another one for you. Black and white. What about black and white architectural pictures? Do they work?
Oh, that's a good question. It's in answer yes, actually, because a few days ago someone did actually show me a couple of architectural shots of the pier at Weston-super-Mare, and actually they were surprisingly good. So yes, in the right light and shot in the right way, and it's not going to be a universal thing that to say that it would work, but yeah, it's in principle, yes, you can, for sure.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Anyone else out there? So we're getting lots of people on chat saying thanks for the talk. So yeah, thanks to everybody who's thanked me on chat as well. Okay, so if nobody's got any more questions, I'm going to close the talk. So any more questions, or I guess probably not. In that case, I'm going to close the talk. Thank you so much for coming along this evening, and hopefully I'll see you in June for the June talk on people photography. And until then, have a great month, and hopefully we'll get a bit of summer weather shortly. So good night, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone.